Well, the conservatives have won in Germany. Well, some of them have. Some of them won in Germany. In fact, it was a very, very interesting night because the mainstream center-right party in Germany, the Christian Democrats, won about 28%, give or take, of the vote, which in a parliamentary democracy means that they're pretty much in the best position in order to be the dominant party within the parliament, which was what was quasi-expected was that the AFD, which of course the mainstream media has listed as the far-right political party, actually came in second place, which means pretty much the two conservative parties in Germany are the ones that won the first place and second place spots, with left-wing parties such as the Social Democrats, the Greens, and whatnot basically coming in third, fourth, respectively. What's interesting is the parties that lost any representation within Parliament, and perhaps what's most interesting is that the two conservative parties, the Christian Democrats and AFD, the primary one has decided that they will not work with AFD under any circumstances. And that doesn't just mean that they're not going to form a coalition government with them, which is typically what would happen in these circumstances. In many cases, they're trying to shut them out of the government as much as possible because, quite frankly, there's been a concerted effort to ban the AFD, to make it illegal to exist as a political party. So the second most popular political party in Germany, one that won second place by a pretty good margin, the other political parties were attempting to ban not that long ago, and all of the political parties have vowed not to work with them. So what we're going to discuss today is what actually happened in Germany, why, how we think the coalition is actually going to develop going forward, and why any of this is important to us. Because I promise you, even though we might not be especially interested in election outcomes in Germany, we probably should be, because Germany has a great deal of influence on the rest of Europe, and what's going on in Germany right now, in some cases, is replicated not only in other parts of Europe, but also in the United States. All of that and more coming up on this episode of Making the Argument. I'm your host, Nick Freitas, member of the Virginia House of Delegates, but other than that, a reasonably good guy. With me in the studio, my beautiful bride, Tina, Queen of the Bees.
Hello, everyone.
Then, of course, we have our resident historian, political prognosticator, political prognosticator, and the Oracle of Virginia, Christian Hines. How you doing, man?
I'm doing well. This is a topic that I'm really looking forward to. I tracked the election results meticulously when they came in. So finally, I have somebody that I can actually talk to about this stuff.
We have all kinds of election results to go over, and it's always a fun time to go over election results with Christian because he's really good at predicting this within the United States. And it's been increasingly...
there's always a history lesson.
Oh, yeah.
Or 5 in there.
Speaking of history lessons, I remember when I told both of you that True Classic was one of the best producers of clothing materials on the planet. And that's not just history. That's current. That's current facts. In fact, I'm wearing one of my favorite True Classic long sleeve shirts today because True Classic provides it all. Like I love their workout gear. I love the t-shirts, right? I love the hoodies. I love all of it. They just produce really good quality material. And the reason why I love it so much is because, quite frankly, as a dude, you just feel good wearing it. It accentuates all of the stuff that you want accentuated while providing a little excess roominess for maybe some of the areas you're still working on in your workout routine. And the best news is if you go to trueclassic.com/Nick and bundle, you can save. Now, I've said this before, and I'll say it again. The first time I ever got True Classic, it was not my purchase. It was Tina's purchase. That's right. Tina took a look at the t-shirt options within True Classic, saw something that would fit me better around the shoulders, arms, and chest, and said, I'm going to get that for my husband because I think he'll look snazzy in it.
I kept seeing commercials for it on Instagram, and I was like, wow, Nick would like these.
And I remember thinking to myself, why did you buy me these t-shirts? I shop where every other middle-aged man shops, Costco. That's where I get my clothing. But I slipped these on, and I was like, ooh.
He didn't understand why I bought him like 10 t-shirts at a time.
But I understand now because it's like all I wear. And again, guys, I'm going to tell you this. All of us had New Year's resolutions to get back to the gym to feel good. I will tell you right now, if you're going into the gym and you're trying to work out in one of those baggy t-shirts that make you feel either skinny or stupid, you're not going to go to the gym as much. But if you go wearing the sort of t-shirt that, let's just say helps you see the results better, it becomes a regular part of your routine. So trueclassic.com/Nick. Go on there, take a look. I'm promising you're not going to be disappointed. They have a great product, and it's a great way to support this show. So check that out. All right. Let's go ahead and jump into what the heck is going on in the Deutschland with the Germans. So Germany's conservatives win as AfD secures record second place finish, exit poll shows. Again, we've gone over to Grand News here to take a look at some of the articles available. I got to tell you, let's go over to this next one. I want to take a look at this. Actually, we'll say this for the Christian Democratic Union and the Christian Social Union. So to give you an idea, think of the Christian Democratic Union as kind of like Germany's version of the Republican Party. Under like Mitt Romney, and then
That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, and then the Christian Social Union is kind of like it's the Bohemia version.
It's the Bavarian.
Sorry.
You were about to offend a lot of Germans and
people
Czechs.
in German and Czechs. Sorry, yeah, it's the Bavarian version of the Christian Democratic Union. So imagine if like Texas had its own kind of like version
Unique
of the Texas
brand of the
Texas
GOP.
Republican Party, right? That's kind of what happened.
Well,
here.
similar to how like in Minnesota, it's the Democratic Farmer Labor Party instead of just the Democratic Party.
Yeah. So they won 28.5% of the votes, which again, when you're talking about a parliamentary democracy, right? They're not necessarily going to elect the president, right? You're voting for a slate of candidates based off political parties, and whichever political party kind of gets the most votes. Typically, the leader of that party ends up becoming the prime minister, or in Germany, it's the chancellor. But they have to actually form a coalition government, right? Because if you don't get over 50%, you can't actually organize your government, or what we would call organizing your administration. And so they've 28% puts them in the lead, but they still got to find people to work with in order to establish their party. The far right, because that's always how they're described, AfD secured second place with 20% of the votes, according to ZDF exit poll data. Now, again, together you're like, oh, that's 48.5, so they still got to find someone else. No, and the reason why is because you win a percentage of the vote. If your political party does not get over 5% of the vote, you don't get any seats in parliament.
Unless you win 3 direct seats. And so Germany has this really weird electoral system
Go ahead,
where
take us away.
There's 2 ballots that you're given when you go in to vote. Your first one is for directly electing a member to the Bundestag that, like by name, a candidate that is on the ballot. So you vote for, John Q. Public or whatever. But then your second ballot is for a party. So your first ballot is for a candidate who is probably a member of a party. But then your second ballot is for a specific party, not a candidate. Now, whoever wins the election on the candidate list, well, they get elected to the Bundestag. That's like about half of all the seats. But the other half of the seats is allocated by party list across a geographic region. And so what happens quite a lot, and we'll see this when we look at the maps, for example, what happens quite a lot is that a party can win the candidate lists everywhere, but that doesn't mean that they're winning 100% of the seats there, because even if they're winning all the constituency elections, for example, CSU more or less won all the constituency seats in Bavaria. But that doesn't mean that 100% of the seats in Bavaria are going to the CSU, because AfD won a bunch of seats, SPD even won a few seats in that region, Greens won a few seats. And so they have that in a way that allows for a semi-multi-member system. But like you said, if you don't get 5% of the vote nationwide, then you get no seats on the party lists unless you win 3 direct constituency seats. Then you can have seats in the German parliament.
But in this case, certain parties, to include ones that were actually part of the governing coalition of the current government or the
outgoing government,
didn't win enough seats to even have seats in parliament.
They're going to have none.
Yeah, they're going to have none. So part of the ruling coalition, which was called the Traffic Light Coalition, because the parties for the colors were red, yellow, and green. The yellow's out, right?
The Free Democrats are gone, and they were historically the Libertarian Party in Germany.
Yeah, so they are out. All right, let's go to this next one.
Some important lessons to learn from that. Don't ever form a coalition with socialists if you're a libertarian.
If you claim
party.
to be libertarian, don't form the government with the socialists of the party. All right. So this is, I found this, I thought it was a fairly decent guide to Germany's political parties. We're going to scroll through this pretty quickly, but just to give everyone kind of an idea of what we're talking about. So the CDU, the Christian Democrat Union, or the Christian Social Union, they usually just go by CDU. Their color is black. Friedrich Merz. So to give you an idea, Merz actually had kind of he used to belong to the CDU a while back, had kind of a fight with Angela Merkel. She won the fight within the internal party, and Merz actually stepped down and went into the private sector
BlackRock.
and worked for BlackRock. Worked for BlackRock for some time. But Merz was also considered the more conservative. Like Angela Merkel really, if you look at the governments
Open
that
the
she formed,
floodgates.
oh my gosh. Like the reason why Angela Merkel kind of fell out of favor with a lot of more conservative voters in Germany is because the CDU was essentially governing like the conservative party in the UK. Right, the conservative meant that they were slightly less liberal than the more liberal parties. Right, that's how they were operating in many respects. She actively worked to shut down Germany's nuclear plants. They were a huge friend to mass immigration. So in many respects, people are like, "What is the like the conservative party?" I get all the crap I don't like with the more like socialist or left wing parties, but I just don't get as
But
many
it's branded
welfare
as
benefits.
conservative.
Right?
What's
Yeah.
funny is to hear their media describe him as very Trump-like.
Yeah, which is a
and
joke.
when we look at him, we're going, no, actually, he's very Mitt Romney-like, actually.
But that was even considered. But it just goes to show you, right? Like
Like
even in
our most watered-down, feckless conservatives are more conservative than their conservatives.
yeah,
Yeah, this is
Yeah.
how this works.
that
It's okay
is-
though. We
But-
haven't
but
gone
again,
through all the lists.
But to say that Merz is considered more conservative than Angela Merkel. So
Okay.
the party as a whole has moved more toward the right.
But he has already come out and said that they're not going to shut down their borders and they're
They're
not
not going to work with the
Yep.
AFD. They want, even though he's considered more pro-U.S. than other people, it's still like it's still a colder relationship with the Trump administration, et cetera. All right, next one. Just go ahead and scroll down. This is just talking about more
There,
things.
well, I kind of want to get into who votes for each
We'll
party.
get
at
into
some
that, but not
point.
on this one. All right.
Okay.
Social Democratic Party. This is the SPD. Their color is red because they're leftists, and everywhere else in the world, red is always associated with left, and generally blue is associated with right. So the voter base, the center-left Social Democratic Party, has traditionally been the party of the working classes and trade unions. Like the CDU is an aging voter base, the SPD's most fertile ground in Germany was traditionally the densely populated industrial region of Western Germany, particularly the Ruhr region and Northern Rhine-Westphalia, as well as the states of Hesse and Lower Saxony. Again, it's the SPD was founded in 1870 and making it Germany's oldest political party. In the tumultuous first decades of the 20th century, the party acted as an umbrella organization for a number of leftist movements, trade unionists, and communists. So just keep in mind, we've talked about this before.
Bismarck hated them.
Yeah, we mentioned this before. Whenever they say like this is a party, now again, I'm not claiming that it's the same thing that it was, in the early 20th century, but it is more of a socialist party.
It certainly has. So the SPD was actually in some ways a Marxist party that renounced violent revolution.
Yeah.
And so they thought they believed in democratic socialism. And so they wanted the same ends, but they thought they could vote their way to get that.
Yeah.
And over time they became, kind of less revolutionary and just we're a party of trade unions, working class voters, particularly in the Rhineland where Germany's industrial heartland was. They were famously the party that stood up against the Nazis during the Enabling Act vote. They were the only one to vote against it. And then they were immediately outlawed.
Yeah.
And then after World War II, they came back and they did moderate insofar as they're not an explicitly Marxist party anymore.
Yeah.
They're now what they call a social democratic party, which is, you could say it's socialist insofar as, they're not like a free market capitalist party, but what they really are is a trade union party.
They don't want to abolish the private ownership of the means of production, but they do believe in nationalizing many sectors of what you might consider major strategic industries. Not all, but some. They believe in a massive welfare state. They're openly advocating for more borrowing.
They want a larger welfare state, larger pension system, more government spending, infrastructure projects. That they are in many respects kind of like the Democratic Party in the United States. Although there are some differences.
Yeah. Okay, scroll down to the next one. Scroll faster. The Green Party.
These people are lunatics.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, go ahead. I mean, you've
This is,
done
if
more
Greta
research on
Thunberg ran a party, this would be
this
her
would be
party.
it. Yeah.
They're the party that shut down all the nuclear plants in Germany.
Well,
Is this the one that has the guy that?
No, we'll get to that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
The true lunatics, the true
Yeah.
degenerate Marxists in Germany. We'll get to them. Don't worry. Green Party is the party of deindustrialization. That is the best way I would describe
Yeah.
it. They're the party of degrowth and deindustrialization. They are an anti-human party. They hate energy. They want Germany to go back to the Stone Age. Their preferred era of German history would be 1946, when there was nothing left standing in Germany.
Yeah,
because
but there was no CO2.
Yeah, and I say 1946 because the evil bad Nazis are gone.
Yeah.
But so is all the infrastructure. So is all the power
Yeah.
plants. They're an anti-human party. They hate energy. And again, like, they led the charge to decommission the nuclear plants. They're the reason that Germany is literally deindustrializing right now. Their industrial sector. Germany is very famous historically for being a manufacturing powerhouse, and they're losing that edge now because they don't have access to energy, and it's in part because the Green Party's insane policies. And you know who was an early participant in kind of what became the Green Party was Rudy Dutschke.
Oh God, we'll get to that. To give you an idea, Rudy Dutschke is the one that coined the term "the long march through the institutions." Completely dedicated Marxist. He just believed that the way that you were actually going to bring Marxism to Western countries was you were going to infiltrate culturally shaping institutions, academia, et cetera, and then over time it would just be a natural. It's kind of
And it happened.
Well, he believed in like Antonio Gramsci's cultural Marxism,
War of position.
Yeah. So, but to give you an idea, according to this site, which is a little bit less conservative, the environmentalist Greens rely heavily. Like, who does this sound like in the United States? The environmentalist Greens rely heavily on the well-educated urban demographic for their voter base. Party strongholds tend to be major cities in Western Germany, especially where universities are located. Green voters have become more affluent over the years, and the Greens struggle to attract voters from lower income classes. They gain support from young voters due to the Fridays for Future movement and the general concern over the effects of climate change. These were the guys. Again, this is if Greta Thunberg had a party, this would be it. And again, this is like, I look at this as like, this is the perfect party of kind of like
University student activists who can't do math.
And college professors who are affluent because they sit in, cushy positions with well-subsidized government, pensions and well-subsidized government research projects. They're the ones that, inevitably get invested in green energy companies that get heavily subsidized by the government. And oh, by the way, they end up doing well as a result.
The Greens are also like the Democratic Party in the U.S., just a specific wing with it. You're gonna realize this, that as we go through the left-wing parties, the SPD is like the Democrats, certain elements of it. There are several wings, the welfare wing, trade union wing of the Democratic Party. The Greens are, the student activists, the university professors, the affluent urbanites.
So all the people gluing themselves to crosswalks and throwing paint on works of art in the Louvre.
That's these people.
That's these people. All right, go down. We're not being very fair to them.
And here's the
alternative
AFD.
for Germany.
These guys made the news the most, arguably.
Light blue. All right, let's look at how DW describes the voter base. The AFD has poached voters from all the other major parties except the Greens. That's not surprising. And has simultaneously succeeded in mobilizing many non-voters. The AFD scores best among middle income to low income earners, though that is by no means its exclusive voter base, and draws votes from across social classes. It is especially successful in Eastern Germany. Its membership, meanwhile, has one significant feature: only 17% are women. What's funny, though, is their leader is not only a woman, but a lesbian woman who, again, is married to a Sri Lankan. So every time you hear that the AFD is a bunch of far-right radicals that want to just, they try to make them like they're the neo-Nazi party, right? Like all they want is the Aryan blood or whatever. Again, their leader is a female lesbian with a wife from Sri Lanka, if I remember correctly. So, just check the narrative that you're
clearly
getting.
It's kind of like calling the previous guy very Trump-like. It's all, there's just a ton of hyperbole.
Yeah. Yeah, the far right Alternative for Germany has surged to prominence since it was founded in 2013 as a Eurosceptic party. Since then, Germans have elected the AfD to the federal as well as every other state parliament and regional elections, as well as the European Parliament. I would say that it's really been over the last, what would you say, about 6 years that they have significantly increased their presence. The first time where I think people where Europe started to get scared and where all of a sudden the German political establishment started advocating to ban the AfD to where they couldn't even participate in Germany, was when they won a bunch of seats in European Parliament. And that was kind of a precursor to what happened in this election cycle, where they came in second. They doubled their seats in Parliament, getting more than the SPD, which I don't think most people anticipated that would happen.
They beat the SPD. I mean, they're a serious political force now. They're 20% of the country.
Yeah.
And they did not exist 15 years ago.
Yeah.
They barely existed 10 years ago.
Let me give you an idea too on what they're describing this way. The AfD was originally created by a group of neoliberal academics as a protest against the single European currency. That sounds
That is
libertarian.
actually technically true.
Yeah, and
that's
like a libertarian position. It was the idea that a single European currency was going to cause great problems, especially for Germany, because it would essentially have its currency tied to other countries that had incredibly bad fiscal policy.
By the way, this is why AfD is partially unique among right-wing populist parties on the European continent, in that they are an economically liberal, and when I say liberal, I mean that in the classical sense, party. A lot of right-wing populist parties, not all of them, but a lot of right-wing populist parties on the European continent are economically protectionist or pro-welfare state, or I wouldn't say like straight up socialist, but they're definitely more interventionist.
Yeah.
National Rally is a good example of this. Historically, National Rally was not like a pro-free market, libertarian economics, Austrian school style party. Now, they have actually moderated their position on economics. They're certainly more pro-free market today than ever before.
Yeah.
But AfD has from its beginning always been a anti-bailout, tax and spend, anti-left-wing economics party. That's how they started. But after the European migrant crisis began, actually under Angela Merkel in 2015, the AfD became much more prominent because of Germans who were upset about mass migration into their country, basically, and then the increase in things like terrorist attacks, that the AfD grew not based off of being upset over like the European debt zone crisis or bailing out Greece. It became more prominent because, again, this backlash against mass migration.
Yeah.
But they've always retained that economically free market perspective. That's actually what allows their coalition to exist, because they're peeling off voters that were previously voting for some other parties that we're going to get into, like the yellow part of the traffic light coalition.
Well, I want to talk about this here real quick, because we talked about, they were angered specifically by Merkel's decision to bail out Greece in 2010. That's the sort of thing that the AfD, the original founders of the AfD, were worried about. It's like, if you tie our currency to a bunch of countries that have horrible fiscal policy, we will suffer as a result. And lo and behold, they did. Because, but then, following the influx of refugees, mainly from war-torn Syria in 2015, the party set an overtly nationalist, anti-immigrant, and anti-Islam agenda. Now, this is the part where, again, when you say nationalist in the United States, we tend to associate that more with like patriotism. When you say nationalist in Germany, people get really worried about the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which was the Nazis. And so, if there's one thing every European school child has been told since the moment they were required to go to their state education camps, right? It was to beware of nationalists, to beware of nationalism. It's why there's always been this kind of fight for kind of this greater pan-European culture and environment. And anyways, but when it says it set an overtly nationalist, anti-immigrant, and anti-Islam agenda, I want to read for you because this is another thing that I have a problem with, is whenever they say something like anti-immigrant, when you read what like AfD is saying right now on their platform, I don't think it's fair to categorize it as just blanketly anti-immigrant. What they say is the AfD wants to prevent refugees from heading to Germany at all. Now they say refugees, but keep in mind something, right? Syrian refugees, Algerian refugees, right? These are two of the Afghan refugees. How many countries do you have to get through to get to Germany from Afghanistan, right? Syria or Algeria? Algeria is the closest because, okay, you cross the Mediterranean Ocean and now you only got to get through arguably two countries, right, to be able to make it to Germany, right? Unless you go all the way around and into the Baltic Sea and come in that way. But when you're talking about Syria, and Afghanistan.
And how many of those countries have that you go through have a much closer
Culture.
cultural footprint to where you're coming
Culture,
from? Like,
religion,
last I
economic
checked,
systems.
a lot of these migrants are going through Turkey, which is also an Islamic country, also a Middle Eastern country. Now, it's not an Arabic country, right?
No.
Turkey's filled with Turks, but and Kurds. But the point being that it is very interesting that Germany, which is in the dead center of Europe, needs a bunch of, Yemen, Syrian, North African, Middle Eastern refugees that could perfectly go to Saudi Arabia, Jordan.
Well, as we pointed out,
it's got to be too loose of a definition of refugee. Just like in our situation where we have people,
asylum seeker.
coming all the way up from Honduras, and I'm like, how many, like, why didn't you stop along the way at some of these other countries where you don't even have to learn a new language to move into?
Well, and in this case too, here's the also frustrating part about this when they talk about anti-immigrant or anti-Islam. When you have, I think it was a German judge, or was it I think it was a German judge that handed down just a ridiculously light sentence for somebody who I believe raped a German girl. And the judge essentially said, well, it's not really his fault because he was raised in a culture that doesn't share, Germany's perspective on this.
Oh, and then we're called racists and bigots when we point out that their culture allows for rape.
Or when you just say that, look,
I don't like the way that culture views women or treats women, and now we're big bigots.
When the AFD points out that diametrically opposed values within different cultures probably don't merge well, and they get called racist, but then a judge lets somebody off with an incredibly light sentence because, well, they were raised in a culture that is very different from our own. Oh, okay, I get it. So if you're a German and you do this, we're throwing the book at you, as you should. But if you come from a culture which we were told that all cultures are equally valuable, now we're gonna use that as an excuse to not give you the same sentence.
When the law doesn't work like that, and when you have basically a two-tier system, kind of like what's happening in Britain right now and everything else, when that happens, you get people that start taking the law into their own hands.
Well,
you get people who become vigilantes, and the thing is that's all fine and dandy here, where we all can still go deal out some justice, but over there.
Oh my God!
What are they gonna do? How you gonna
I'll tell you what they're
beat them?
This is why.
Gonna hit them with your butter knife?
This is part of the reason why. There's other reasons, but this is part of the reason why the mainstream narrative of the AFD, which I think is utterly false, but mainstream narrative is the AFD is basically a proto-Nazi or a proto-fascist party, depending on who you speak to. Now, their evidence for this is basically it consists of this. The argument that the AFD is a Nazi or fascist party begins with, well, they believe in defending a traditional culture, German identity, and because we're in a post-national era and we're a bunch of Awikophobic liberals who despise our own culture and our own traditions and our own history, anybody that embraces these things must be bad guys. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing that they do is that they find like internet chat logs and stuff like that on places like 4chan or Discord or whatever. Of like activists or members of the party that say some, let's be honest,
bad things,
colorful
things.
stuff, bad things. But let's be honest too, when we're talking about political parties of hundreds of thousands of people or millions of people, depending on the country and the party in relation to, it is inevitable that if you go digging on the internet enough, you will find questionable or objectionable content from people that claim to be supporters of that party. If the Democratic Party in the United States had to answer for every outrageous comment said in a private setting of anybody that was a voter of that party, the Democratic Party would cease to exist in this country. The same could arguably be said of the Republican Party. There's no limitation to the number of stupid things that people say on the internet. That is not necessarily to say then that every single person, 20% of the German population that votes for AFD are Hitlerites. That is an absurd conclusion because you can dig up again, quotes on the internet from random people.
Yeah, I want to get through the rest of this real quick because this is the part where I think also like they see dog whistles, right? Is the party insists on the primacy of traditional German culture and rejects Islam as a part of German society. Well, that might have something to do with a massive influx of Islamists into Germany that have no problem expressing that their desires for Germany to become an Islamic nation, which would be a complete departure from traditional Germany, right? It also questions the notion that climate change is man-made, which again, you got to understand, this is absolute heresy to the Greens. But again, more and more evidence suggests that kind of what we've always known. Yes, human beings impact the environment, but the idea that they're somehow like on the verge of causing, the oceans to swallow up Great Britain is probably a little exaggerated.
Well, what's more heretical is their support for nuclear.
They also aim to reintroduce nuclear energy. And, again, this is fascinating because you would think at a time where Germany had become so dependent on Russian natural gas for its power, and then all of a sudden the heating bills are going up in Germany in the middle of winter and old people are dying. This is one of the reasons why there's a lot of people that said, I don't care what you're saying anymore. They want to actually bring back reliable, affordable energy. Good enough for me. And they want to uphold family values and opposes diversity and gender issues. Remember, I love it when they say diversity.
And the head of this is a lesbian.
Yeah, married to a Sri Lankan, right? Like they oppose diversity and gender issues. No, what they probably oppose is DEI style programs. What they probably oppose is the alphabet mafia wanting to trans your child. That's the sort of
what we
things,
call wokeism is what they oppose.
the AFD, here he goes. The AFD wants to limit NATO's operational area to the territories of its member states and replace the EU with the new organization. Okay, that's not far right.
No, but that's very controversial for you to be anti-EU and say, I want to get rid of it and replace it. It sounds to me that they want something like the Council of Europe that existed, where it's not an integrated, Brussels-run, managerial class-driven entity, but it's more. Nigel Farage talked about this when he was part of the EU Parliament, where he's like, fine, let's have an organization where we can get together and discuss these things as adults and cooperate freely amongst each other. But let's not chuck aside national sovereignty
without giving up our sovereignty.
And the will of the people within those countries and redirect all that power to unelected bureaucrats in Brussels.
Yeah.
And so he wanted what used to be called the Council of Europe. AFD wants something like that where they're not against European cooperation. What they're against is usurping national sovereignty.
Yes.
And they've doubled and even tripled down on that, which is what's made them so heretical. What makes them so different from a lot of other like right-wing populist parties in Europe is that a lot of those right-wing populist parties, like in Italy and France, you could argue in the UK, although they're a little bit out of this because they're no longer in the EU, is that those parties arguably moderated in a lot of those positions. Going into this election, AFD doubled down on those positions, basically flipped the bird to the EU and said, like explicitly said, if we get into power, we are going to fundamentally change our relationship with the EU and we're going to deport all of these people that should not be here, that don't want to be a part of our culture. Like they didn't moderate on that at all. They intentionally did not change their tune.
Well, and I think what's important to understand here as well is because Americans look at something like the EU and that just seems unconscionable to us. Like we can't imagine entering in to the sort of agreement with a variety of other, like we can't imagine entering into some sort of like North and Central America alliance where now all of a sudden there's a North American parliament that we all send people to, and that could actually require the United States to do various things, or that we would share a currency with Nicaragua. Like that's not even something that we can fathom, right? But in Europe, the EU has become almost synonymous with preventing war in Europe. Because if you look at European history, for as long as you go back, it was always European countries going to war with one another. And the EU, whether you rightly or wrongly, has been credited with helping to prevent wars in Europe. And so the idea of wanting to leave the EU for many people, and they have marketed it this way, and this is important to remember, right? You've got generations of school children that have grown up like, oh yes, once upon a time Europe went to war. We were in a constant state of warfare with one another. But then post World War II, a new order came about. Now we have the EU, and this is all to prevent going back to the old bad days of us all going to war with one another. And so therefore wanting to leave the EU to many people is probably wanting to go back to the battle days of constant conflict within Europe.
Yes.
All right, let's scroll down and look at some of the other parties. We spent a lot of time on AfD, but there's a reason.
These guys.
The left's party stronghold was traditionally in former East Germany, which is interesting because East Germany is now the stronghold for the AfD, with former communists who supported the German Democratic Republic and protest voters who wanted to express their disenchantment with traditional parties. However, many of these have switched to the populist national of the AfD since 2015. History. Though it was only founded in 2007, the Left Party has a much longer history and is still considered a direct descendant of the Socialist Unity Party that ruled East Germany until reunification with the West in 1990. This is one of the most interesting dynamics of all of this is a party that's, very left wing, but it was in large part because, when the wall came down, you still had a lot of Germans that, communism and leftism and that was all they knew. That was what they'd grown up on. And so that
even when given free elections,
yes,
plenty of them voted for basically communists or Marxists. The Die Linke, which is what I might be butchering it in German, but Die Linke is the degenerate Marxist communists. That is the party that I was telling you about earlier.
Do we have a picture of the dude?
Oh,
let's scroll.
Is there a picture of that guy?
Okay, give me a second and I'll pull it up. Nick, you've got to see this.
I just looked at it and I went, oh my gosh, it's every leftist in America today.
Here it is. Here it is.
Right.
I just want to point out for a second though that Tina asked for this.
I asked for this because
here you go.
That's
Die Linke right there.
That dude on the right looks like every freaking Democrat I've ever seen in my life.
Oh my gosh. That's what you get why I called them degenerate Marxists.
This reminds me of the old SNL skit, Sprockets. This is the part on Sprockets for every dance. it was Michael Miles like, all right, this is the part on Sprockets for we've returned Germany into a socialist hellscape.
The person on the left looks like they're speaking in a German accent, honestly.
You know what's funny though is that these people probably would have been sent off to the asylums.
Oh yeah,
under the German Democratic Republic, which again, Die Linke is the legal successor in many ways of the Socialist Party that ran East Germany. So it's just kind of, that's why I said that they're like degenerate Marxists is the best way for me to describe it.
All right, scroll down. Let me see here. The Left Party rejects deportations, wants to dissolve the EU Border Protection Agency, Frontex, and demands asylum for economic, environmental, and climate refugees, which is everyone. It wants to give all long-term residents the right to vote and to stand for election on the federal level. It wants to lower the retirement age and introduce a solidarity minimum pension financed through tax revenue paid for by tax increases for the very rich.
Yeah, this is much better when you say it all in a German accent.
Rich, yes. This is what they want. It is all very simple. All right. And then we got the Free Democratic Party. They lost big time. A neoliberal pro-free market party, the Free Democratic Party traditionally finds the most voters among the self-employed, especially business owners and professionals like dentists and lawyers. Its support from the working class is marginal. One of the things to keep in mind here is, again, I think one of the reasons why they're kind of one of the biggest losers and will not have any more seats in parliament is because they decided to join a coalition government with the
SPD and Greens.
SPD and Greens. It's like, don't tell me you're a free market party that is trying to stick up for entrepreneurs and business owners and then side with two of the parties that either want to tax and regulate them to death or deny them any sort of affordable energy in which to run their businesses.
Oh, but all three of them are socially liberal parties. Remember, FDP is in many respects a liberal party. It's a quasi-libertarian party.
So of course you can do the cocaine with the hookers.
The thing that collapsed the Traffic Light Coalition was a budget dispute.
Yeah, well, and it was because they actually made the free market guy the finance minister, and he wouldn't bless off on the budget, and so they had to get rid of him. They left, and then the Free Democrats left the coalition. They no longer had a governing majority. I think they fell to 44% of parliament, and so they had to call a vote of confidence. Okay, go ahead and scroll down on the next one.
The FDP historically has been a kingmaker party where they ally with whoever is most likely to form a coalition, and they'll always be like a secondary supporting party. They just made a catastrophic decision that destroyed them. Let's also be honest. Part of the FDP's problem is AfD peeled off a decent chunk of those voters that were attracted to the economic free market component of the AfD, not necessarily the rest of the populist elements of the party.
Yeah. So the BSW, I'm not even going to try to say it all. The BSW, mainly former Left Party and former AfD supporters, mainly in Eastern Germany, founded in 2024 by Left Party renegades. The populist Sarah Wagenknecht Alliance is left-wing on economic issues such as social justice, job security, higher wages. It wants to revamp Germany's tax system. However, the BSW is close to the far right on issues like immigration and gender diversity and climate policy, opposing a shift toward renewable energy, including electric vehicles. This would probably be somewhere. This is
You
weird.
could call them nationalists and socialists.
As a national socialist.
I'm being a bit coy
How
here.
come they're
but,
not called far left, right?
like, well, they actually are a far left party, but it is a weird coalition, BSW, where they are nationalistic, but they're not free market. Again, AfD is ostensibly a free market party.
Yeah. You know what the BSW also have was the old classic National Socialists. They are not very friendly to the Jews. Are
they?
They're not. They're one of the ones that referred to Gaza Strip as an open air prison.
Oh yeah, but here's the thing. They're also like in some ways a pro-Russian party. They've called for like halting military support to Ukraine.
I mean, can you call them pro-Russian, or are they just they seem somewhat non-interventionist when it comes to like.
What it is that they want Russian energy.
Yeah,
and they're they're weird because they're a left-wing party in many things, but they're anti-green party insofar as like they want the nuclear power back, they want oil and natural gas.
They strike me as more of kind of like a traditional left-wing workers' party.
Yes, they've tried to be what the SPD used to be like 100 years ago.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's all.
And that's it. And by the way, BSW almost won seats.
Yes.
They
in
just
fact,
like
they
FDP
actually,
came on the edge.
Less than 0.3% to actually get in. All right, let's go to the key facts about the actual election here. So 7 facts. Oh wait, I don't want to go into this. We kind of already talked about AfD's.
Well, do you want me
let's go to this?
I want to show you some of the actually.
Let's go to this.
So these are the exit polls.
Walk us through it.
So here's the. By the way, for the American audience, I don't know why they do this. Maybe we're the weird ones, but since I'm an American, I'm going to be biased in favor of the American system. They use commas the way that we use periods. So just understand that when you're looking at these figures here. For the audience, this is a chart. For the audio listeners, this is a chart that shows the voter breakdown in Germany on the elections. So SPD got 16.41. I know that that's a comma, right? Just understand. In Germany, that's how they do it.
They get it. You can continue on.
Yeah.
The commas as the decimal points.
Union, which again, CDU, they got 28.52. Green got 11.61. FDP, which lost all their seats because they didn't get 5% and they didn't win 3 individual constituencies, they got 4.33. AfD came in second place at 20.8%. Die Linke, which again are the degenerate Marxists, they got 8.77. BSW came just shy of actually winning seats. They almost did. They got 4.97, and then a bunch of everybody else, the equivalent.
We
of
didn't get
parties.
into Andere.
That's just everybody else.
Oh,
that's like that's like third parties.
Of people. All right, cool.
So that's the breakdown of the results. Now.
This is what
the
this
gains.
is. This is okay. So this is
losses.
the part. Yeah, this is the part where you get some indication of what's going on right here. So FDP got crushed. Like them and SPD had the worst night percentage wise, but FDP was enough to completely kick them out. This is something that how does this relate to American politics? I think the lesson here is when you try to play this game of I don't care about anything else, I'm just free market. That doesn't get it done. It especially doesn't get it done in an environment where people believe that their culture is completely under assault. And so if you're going to try to play this game, we're like, oh, look, we're a broad coalition. We do whatever you want, but we're going to have free market economics. What usually ends up happening is you get the whatever you want part, and then you don't get the free market economics. And then when they agreed to
then you get chaos because there's no unifying principle to anything.
Yeah, exactly. And then they wanted to align themselves. Like, okay, well, you just lost trust because you clearly don't understand the operational environment if you think that this is purely about free market economics. And again, I am adamantly pro free market. The SPD, it's not surprising that they got shellacked.
They were the leaders of the last government.
They were the leaders of the last government, and again, that's kind of the Democratic Party of Germany right now, but they got crushed. the union did well, but they didn't actually have the biggest percentage jump, right? The biggest percentage jump by far was AFD.
They doubled their vote share.
Yeah, I would have thought, I mean, you might be looking at this thinking, gosh, the Greens actually, I mean, yeah, they lost seats, but it's, you know, it's not as bad as it could have been, especially since Germany's dealing with major energy policies right now, and the Greens were at the forefront of being responsible for all that. Why didn't they lose more seats? I think that's a good question. If I had to guess, and I don't know, so if somebody from Germany is watching this, please leave something in the comments. If I had to guess, I think in some way it goes back to what the base of the Greens are. The Greens are your college educated, either activists or professorial. Of course, they're kind of, they tend to be higher income. And so essentially they're in a position where in many cases they don't feel the pain of their policies as much as everybody else. They get to sit in their little ivory towers and pretend like, you know, everyone else is just too stupid to understand how brilliant we all are. Right. Okay. Well,
they're shielded from the consequences of their own actions because they're all in universities or NGOs or any sort of government protected position that it doesn't matter if the economy is in recession. They're still getting their job, you know, paycheck. And
the thing that prevents them from probably ever being the dominant party in Germany also in some ways potentially insulates them from massive swing losses one way or another.
But overall, the left shifted from voting for left-wing people in Germany. Shifted from, you know, SPD and Greens to arguably more radical positions, Die Linke and BSW. BSW is a bit more complicated because they share some similarities with the right from a nationalist perspective.
Here's where you can look at it. Here's where you can look at it with BSW, I think. And again, this is the part where if the United States was broken down into multiple parties, you would see this manifesting in place. You would see like John Fetterman is probably more of a BSW guy than you would maybe definitely more than like a Green Party guy or a Der Linke guy, because he's kind of a working class guy, and you know he doesn't buy into some of the more extreme stuff.
Even though he votes for most of it.
Yeah, he votes for it, but he doesn't lead with it, right? He votes for it because we have a two-party system, or we have a multi-party system, but only two parties.
I'm not sure he's working class. He's more like workout shorts class.
To your point, though, the left shifted from voting for the traditional social democratic trade union party of the welfare state to definitely more radical positions on the left. And by the way, people who also suffered in that were the Green Party and the FDP. Likewise, on the right just by and large benefited, right? Like CDU benefited marginally, but AFD really benefited, right? Because they doubled their vote share. So this was overall a shift to the right, but it was also a polarization where you could argue the more boomer centrist type, and I say this for a reason, we're going to get to some voter breakdowns, that has started to collapse in Germany. The traditional CDU, SPD structure, Germany historically was a multi-party system with two dominant parties. That is arguably on its way out the door. And if you want evidence of this, there are, let's see if you scroll down. I'm going to show you some of this other stuff. Don't worry. But and I hope I can find it. Otherwise, I'm just going to have to.
Who voted for whom? You just passed it.
Is this it over time? Yes, this is it over time. So look at. This is a party comparison. Over time. This goes back to 2002. I think there might be another one. Here it is. This is it. This goes back to post-war era.
Okay.
So understand, black is CDU and red is SPD. You can see that in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, it was effectively a two-party system where CDU was the right, SPD was the left, and you could argue the Free Democrats were the kingmakers, right? And then you get, you know, the beginning of the Green Party in the 80s. And so notice how in this period, from the 60s to the 80s, or to reunification, it was effectively a two-party system in Germany. But look at what has happened to both the CDU and the SPD really since like the 2008 financial crisis in Germany. Collectively, they've fallen off a cliff. Even though CDU is going to, you know, SPD was the former government and now CDU is going to become the new government. As a collection between the two, we're a far ways away from the old two-party system that existed 40 years ago in Germany.
Well, and you can tell too by looking at this where these votes went, right? Like, so you had the SPD losing to some of these other, you know, parties, and then I think you had a massive exodus from like Union to AFD. I'm not as convinced that you had a lot of people coming from other parties to the AFD. I think you had some people that were frustrated by energy, a lot of people that were frustrated by immigration. But one of the things that AFD, and again, this is important because this is also instructive for U.S. politics. Part of the reasons why AFD grew so much. So AFD could have made a very, very different decision. So for instance, you look at AFD, they're started off in 2013, 2017, they have a good showing. Right? They're essentially, third in at that point, they could have decided to like significantly moderate. Because they actually lost seats in 21. Right? But then they didn't. They made a conscious decision that no, we are going to stick to we're going to stick to our positions with respect to immigration policy. We're going to stick to our positions with respect to the EU. We're going to stick with our positions with respect to German culture and traditions. And ultimately they were rewarded for it overwhelmingly. They were rewarded for it. And the reason why I say this is instructive is because one of the things that I experience all the time in politics, especially serving in a purple state, right? In a state that's a swing state, is that there's this constant terror whenever you're like 51-49 majorities to don't do anything that is going to like give us trouble within these moderate swing districts, because we got to win it. We can't have the majority. If we don't win them, we can't have the majority. And look, there's an element of truth to it. There's no question. There's an element of truth to that. The problem is that over time, what ends up happening is exactly what you see with the SPD or SPD and Union, is that people look around and they're like, you don't do anything.
They stop voting for them.
You don't do anything. And this is easier to accomplish within parliamentary democracies than it is within the U.S. system, because just the way that we're set up. And I don't necessarily prefer parliamentary systems, just to be clear. What you have in the United States is you have factions within the party that rise to prominence within that group. So, you have the Republicans that left the Republican Party during Trump because in reality, they were more neocon. They were this more neocon status quo. And when the rest of the party wanted to go in a different direction, they just left. And there's really no other place for them to go except to try to, fight within or
turn the Democrats into a neocon party, which is what they're doing now.
Yeah. But the point is that within a parliamentary system, instead of factions rising up within the party that significantly alter it one way or another, although that still happens, you actually have people that completely break off, form their own political parties. And again, when a party presents a genuine alternative, it becomes very attractive to voters who have become convinced that the mainstream parties are never going to do anything. They're always going to talk a good game. They're going to get in power and everything's going to stay the same. And so I think AFD, by sticking to its guns on some of these things, even though they're considered the pariah party by every other, second most popular political party in Germany, is a political party that all of the other political parties, to include the other conservative party, have vowed not to work with.
Loyal to Law asks, does this mean that Germany is finally waking up, or are the German people just choosing the lesser of evils, to put it mildly?
Well, they were choosing the lesser of evils back in the 80s.
Yeah.
In the 90s. I would argue that
are they finally waking up?
They're self-sorting. They're not waking up because you have plenty of people voting for the degenerate Marxists here.
Well, when you're talking about
Greens.
self-sorting, what's really interesting about the map in Germany, did you already show that?
No, let's do that.
Yeah,
Speaking of
show the map.
self-sorting.
The thing that I think is really interesting is that unlike our country, where it doesn't divide up nicely, I mean, we're really divided between rural and urban. And so it makes it really hard. Like, you couldn't really break up our country. But Germany, on the other hand, you could make 3 countries out of that. Four countries.
So there's two maps. Remember when I said that there's 2 ballots that Germans cast? One is for a candidate directly, and the other one is for a party. This is the results by candidate directly.
Yeah.
And, well, I mean, if you open up a history textbook to anything between 1945 and 1990, you would be very familiar with this map.
Yeah, and for those of you who can't tell, down there on the bottom is dark blue. It's different than the black. Yeah, so
well, it's the same thing. CSU and CDU are essentially the same thing.
What I'm trying to say is that when you look at this on the screen, on my screen here, the dark blue looks very similar to the black. So you kind of have to see the difference.
That's
there.
on purpose because they're the sister party to the CDU, just in Bavaria. They're
No,
Bavaria's
I understand.
version
I
of
was
CDU.
just trying to point out that there is a different color there. It's not all black.
Yeah. So again, by color scheme, black is the traditional color of CDU. The dark blue is their Bavarian sister party. Red is SPD. Green is, Greens. And light blue is AFD. Notice how they're, and then pink, which you see in a few places like Leipzig here.
Yeah.
That's the degenerate Marxists. I'm just going to keep calling them that. Die Linke. Notice how there's no yellow. Which is the FDP.
The libertarians did it. Yeah.
And there's no, what is it? Dark purple, which would have been BSW.
It looks like there might be some in Berlin. I don't know.
No, that was Die Linke.
No. Go over to the left. No. Okay, yeah. Zoom in a little bit.
Yeah, so if you look at Berlin, this is Die Linke.
Yeah, you're right.
You actually see a division between East and West Berlin as well on this. But point is that you can very clearly see. By the way, I believe it's up here in Mecklenburg. I don't know specifically. I do know, but I can't remember specifically which one was Angela Merkel's old district. But AFD won that. Point is that when you look at this, you can see East Germany very clearly, can't you?
Yes. Yeah.
AFD won outside of Berlin. Yeah. AFD won every constituency in the former German Democratic Republic, East Germany, except for 3. Yeah. One in the suburbs of Berlin, and one in Leipzig, and one here in in Weimar. Yeah. Actually, that's a bit ironic, but
it is actually.
that's actually incredibly ironic that Weimar elected the degenerate Marxists. Yeah. I didn't even realize that until just now. Oh man, that's a historical parallel. Anyway, so this is the first ballot by candidate. Here's what the map looks like for party. Okay. Remember how?
Yep.
So this isn't for a candidate. You're voting for a party.
Yeah.
It's very similar, except AFD actually won 2 constituencies. They didn't elect a candidate there, but they did win a plurality of the votes in 2 of them for voting for a party.
Yeah.
But again, it's the same divide, right? CDU just wins almost everything in West Germany, CDU and CSU.
Well, I think it's all
East Germany is, in fact, AFD does even better on the party vote in East Germany. They even win a seat in East Berlin.
Yeah. I think here's the interesting thing about this. If you look at, again, the history of Germany in the second half of the 20th century, it's not hard to understand why the CDU would still be very, very strong in West Germany. It's also, I don't think, especially surprising that if you were going to see a political party rise up that was still considered on the right, you'd see it in East Germany because you don't have the same sort of like decades-long commitment to a particular to the CDU. So it shouldn't be as surprising that East Germany would choose a conservative alternative to the CDU if they wanted to go in that particular direction. Especially since the CDU is, again, I think CDU is going to run into the same problems that the Conservative Party in the UK did. It's like they either, and let's get to
That's especially true because Merkel opened the floodgates, and she was the leader of CDU when they were previously in government.
Yeah, Merkel was doing with the CDU exactly what the Conservatives were doing in the UK. It's like they begrudgingly oversaw the Brexit, and then part of the whole reason why Brexit was taking place is because a lot of people in the UK were concerned about sovereignty. They were concerned about immigration. They voted for Brexit. The Conservative Party did not do a good job of managing Brexit. And then the Conservative Party essentially didn't stem the immigration problem. And so eventually they were just kicked out. And it's amazing because Labor had, quote, historic wins. But if you actually look at their, quote, historic wins, they weren't that great. It's not that people were excited about Labor. They were furious with conservatives. They were furious with the Tories. This is why you saw the rise of the Reform Party in the UK actually doing very, very well. They didn't pick up a lot of seats in Parliament, but they did very, very well at the overall popular vote. I think they came in third in the
They technically did better than the Liberal Democrats, even though they got only 5 seats, and the Liberal Democrats got over 70.
Yeah, based off of where the votes were located at. The AFD, or excuse me, the Reform Party votes were more spread out.
They were more spread out. Liberal Democrats are clustered in
concentrated,
higher income, wealthier areas. Speaking of voter demographics, I want to show you some really interesting breakdowns by exit polling. And this will give us an idea of who votes for what party. This is simply incredible. This was actually one of the things that I was most looking forward to going through with you. Who voted for who? So here's the total breakdown, right? Which we already discussed. You know, Union came in first, and then AFD came in second. Here's the breakdown by gender. Oh, let's see. Turns out that men were more right-wing than women. So remember, the lighter colors are the total vote.
Yeah.
And now when you do the darker colors, this shows the breakdown by that demographic. So you can see that men were more Union and AFD voters than the overall public, whereas they were fewer Green Party and SPD voters. They were also more FDP.
Yeah.
And so the three parties that you could say are somewhat on the right, FDP being...
Our center right to right, we're all, more...
Men voted for them more than the general public.
Okay, by the same token, all of the left-wing parties had more female voters.
Now, here's something quite interesting. Here's the breakdown by age.
Okay.
So this is like the youngest Zoomers, 18 to 24. Look at this. They're the most politically polarized generation, arguably, in German history, at least in the last 90 years.
Yeah.
They did not vote for the historical two main parties.
No.
They voted for the degenerate Marxists and
or
AFD.
Yeah. And look, that kind of reflects some of what we see in the United States as well.
Younger people were either enthusiastically behind Trump or enthusiastically behind Kamala Harris.
Yes.
There was a hard divide there.
And let's face it, we're also, what's interesting is that we're seeing younger voters go, like Javier Milei in Argentina owes his victory to younger voters in Argentina.
Millennials and Zoomers literally elected him.
Yeah. And then South Korea, same, young men like are the ones that got Ewan over the top over there. So it's interesting to watch what's happening with younger voters.
So let's go through this though. So Zoomers are very divided between Die Linke and AFD, and they're not really on board with Union or SPD.
Yeah.
Here's the youngest millennials. So this would be like my age bracket, right?
Yeah.
Older Zoomers, younger millennials.
So AFD
25 to 34. Again, they're plurality AFD.
Yeah.
And then their second option is
Union.
And then their third option is not SPD, it's Die Linke.
Yeah, it's degenerate communists, right?
And then here's the millennials, right?
Yeah.
Again,
that's AFD and Union.
And AFD is again in first place. So AFD won a plurality of the vote of 25 to 45-year-olds.
Yeah.
The middle age bracket in Germany voted plurality for AFD.
Yeah.
And then their second choice was CDU. And then you get into, as you get older, take a guess what happens.
Yeah, CDU.
CDU.
But AFD still does.
But AFD still does well.
AFD comes in second. Yeah.
This is the 45 to 60.
This is I'm 45.
So AFD still does a little bit better than their overall vote, but you can see Union starts to pull ahead.
Yeah.
And then look at what happens when you get into the 60 and plus. This is 60 to 69. I think Siri picked me up for some reason.
Yeah, they did. Go ahead and go to 60. So 60.
Again, you see how SPD starts to pick up
jump
here.
up.
Look at this jump from, and then look at what happens with the pensioners, right?
Yeah.
The boomers, 70 and up.
Oh yeah, Union SPD.
They're all voting for Union and SPD.
Well, and let's. So if you look at statistics with respect to who does Trump do best with, Trump does, I think, the worst with boomers. He does the best with Gen X, which is my. So I'm Gen X and millennial, like what they call us, like zillennials
you're
or whatever.
Still technically Gen X,
I'm
but you're the
Gen
very,
X.
very, very last
No,
year.
I'm a zillennial. Zillennial is the youngest of the millennials and the oldest of the Zoomers. You're the youngest.
Zennial. Zennial is with an X.
Zillennial.
Not zillennial.
Is the youngest of the millennials, me, and the oldest of the Zoomers.
Whatever.
You're at the
Gen
intersection.
X.
You and I are both at the intersection of different generations.
Yes.
You're at the intersection of millennial and Gen X, and I'm at the intersection of millennial and Zoomer.
Okay, the reason why they make a distinction between the last 5 years of Gen X and the first 5 years of millennials is because most of us grew up in an era where we didn't have social media in our youth. We didn't have social media until we were in like our mid-20s, and even then it was not very prominent. Right, we didn't have cell phones until we were in our early 20s. Like so, but what it meant is that we had a childhood devoid of all this crap, but we're young enough to be able to not be scared of it when it came along and to be able to effectively utilize it. Whereas your boomers are like, how do I use this fandangled thing? and then your later millennials just grew up with it. It was part of it. But what's interesting is in the the reason why I'm pointing this out, how is it relevant to what's going on within the United States? Trump does worse with boomers, with older voters, which is interesting because older voters are generally considered more of your kind of conservative voters. That was usually who the Republican Party relied upon to win elections, is high turnouts among elderly voters, right? That's the one he does like worst with. He does best with Gen X. Then it kind of dips down into lower numbers with millennials, but he's still like above water or like treading pretty close to even. And then it actually, I think it goes up with what, Zoomers? Tina.
Trump does quite bad with boomers and millennials.
Yeah.
He does very well with Gen X, and he does better with Zoomers than he does older millennials that voted for Obama.
The chart showed Trump was 50-50 with boomers. With Gen X, he was up by 12, like plus 12. With millennials, he was up by 4. And with Zoomers, he was up by like
6.
8 or something like there. 6 or 8. Anyway, so it just kind of shows that teeter-tottering back and forth between the generations.
Well, I think what it also demonstrates too, in some respects, this is why when you looked at younger people, it was either between AFD or the
Linke.
Yeah, Linke. I would interest. Can we actually go and look at
I can't.
You can't.
Okay. I wish you could
I wanted to see male, female, young, and old because
we know what it would look like.
Because what we see in the United States is, I'm assuming what we see in a lot of these other places.
Young men under the age of 30 in Germany, probably huge AFD fans. Young women, not so much. But there's 2 more things that I want to show you in these exit polls, Nick.
Yeah.
Might be 3. Here's the education. So this is simply, that's like high school. Yeah. Medium is like college degree. High is like postgraduate, right? So here's the breakdown by, non-college
So if you're like a high
voters.
school grad, you are overwhelmingly Union and AFD.
And look at how much better AFD did with them than the general public.
Yeah.
Here's like college educated.
College educated, now it's tied between AFD and Union. I would not have expected that.
And then
postgraduate, that's where all of a sudden
not
the
surprising.
socialists,
they're all voting for the Greens.
Yeah, all going for the Greens.
And then here's your type of work you do.
Yeah. So, go to pensioners. I want to see pensioners.
You already know what's about to happen.
SPD and
look at off the charts for the 2 major historical parties because they're all boomers voting for them.
And those are the ones that they think are going to maintain essentially the system, which has largely been created to take care of pensioners.
This is I'm going to be a bit mean here for a second. Yeah. This is the most selfish generation in the last century.
Yeah.
And not just in Germany, not just in Europe, in the United States as well, in the whole West. This generation have destroyed the countries that they've enriched. Promises were made that we made to ourselves. And now that we're in our 60s and 70s, we're damn well going to keep it for ourselves at the sake of sacrificing the entire rest of the country because F them. These people, the pensioners that are voting to bankrupt their own countries and, we've got a birth rate crisis because we've created a society and a culture where anybody in their 20s feels like they can't get married and have kids. Yeah, I guess we need to import 1 million Palestinians and Syrians and Yemenites in order to replace them and make them feel like strangers in their own country. As long as I get my welfare check, I'm good to go. Yeah. And then who do they turn around and vote for? They vote for the 2 main establishment parties that are keeping the status quo in place. Once that generation no longer has political power and you get into Gen Xers and millennials and Zoomers that are actually running the show, the SPD and the CDU are going to go extinct is what's going to happen. Because
I don't think you're wrong.
Take a look at what happens for the people that are actually working for a living in Germany. Look at who they voted for.
38 AFD, 22 for Union, and then 12 for SPD.
Turns out that German workers really hated the Social Democratic Party that claims to be a working class party.
Yeah.
Isn't that really ironic that the party of the trade unions and the working man from 100 years ago gets 12% of the working vote? Meanwhile, it turns out AFD is literally a workers' party.
Yeah.
I got to be a bit careful with my choice of words here, but they are, in a very literal academic sense, they are a working class party. They're not just a working class party. They're really a party of the middle of society.
Yeah.
Because look at employees. AFD does just as fine. In fact, they're in line with their average vote here. They're second place behind, and Union actually does worse with
Union does
employees.
worse. SPD does worse. Green does a little bit better. I'm imagining those are like.
And then here's self-employed.
Yeah, self-employed Union does a lot better.
And of course, obviously, self-employed. That makes sense that self-employed Union and FDP would do better with self-employed, and AFD would hold its ground with them because remember,
I'm surprised at how well Green does.
Well, you got to remember those are a lot of professional managerial class people that are like, well, I run my own NGO for a living.
Yeah.
But the point is that the AFD is a broad-based party of everybody who's not a pensioner.
Yeah.
They're a workers' party, an employees' party, and yes, it leaves to some degree a self-employed party, but they're especially a party of the middle of society. Workers and employees voted for especially workers here. Look at that.
Yeah.
And now look at the financial situation, self-reported financial situation. Again, here's the total vote.
Yep.
Here's people who said that they're doing fine.
Yeah.
Good.
I know which two those are going to be.
Oh, man,
Union and SPD.
They loved Union and SPD.
Union, SPD, and Green. BSW broke even.
FDP did a little bit better. Now look at what people who said that they're poor off. Their financial situation's bad. Look
I knew
at
that was going to be. It's AFD overwhelmingly and a little bit BSW. And
so AFD, based on the demographic breakdown,
Yeah.
AFD is a party of the middle of society in terms of age, socioeconomic status, who say that they're financially struggling.
Yeah.
They are a party of millennials and Gen Xers.
Yeah.
A party of Zoomer men.
Yeah.
And a party of workers and employees who say that they're struggling financially.
Yeah.
That is a textbook definition of the exact same type of coalition that got Donald Trump elected in the United States.
Well, and this is, and I think you're going to see more of that with reform in the UK. Although I do think the conservatives are starting to get their act together. Their new leader seems to be a lot better than the previous ones that they've had. Although I still think
that bar was on the floor, though.
Oh, it was. They've got a long way to go, and it's going to take a whole lot more than talk, which is all you can do in the opposition. It's easy to be in the minority because you just sit there and blame, because it's really all you can do in most cases. But yeah, when you look at this again, sometimes people ask, why are we focused America first? Why are we focused? Because what goes on in the other parts of the world actually matters, especially parts that we have long history and relationships with. But it also demonstrates that the sort of movement that we're seeing in the United States is not isolated to the United States. And it's interesting because obviously America and traditionally Western Europe, but increasingly more parts of Europe as well, there is a shared history and there's elements of shared culture there. It's not a one-for-one exchange, obviously, but there's a lot of shared culture. Like early on in the United States, the three largest groups that immigrated to the United States early on was English, German, and Scots-Irish.
I mean, look at my last name.
Yeah.
So are we to the part now where we are talking about who they'll make a coalition with?
Well, I think what has already become evident.
I can tell you who they're not going to make a coalition with.
Well, this is the reason why we went through this whole thing of breaking this down demographically is to demonstrate a couple of things. We spent a lot of time with the AFD because they're the pariah of Germany. They're the far right party. Oh, they're the neo-Nazis. They actively work to ban them, to make the party illegal in Germany. You see now who they do the best with in Germany. You've looked at their platform, which again doesn't sound anything like the various 25 or 27 points of like the Nazi party. And yet the Conservative Democratic Union has vowed that they will not establish a government with the AFD. They are promising to not work with the AFD. It was considered this massive departure when they actually allowed the AFD to kind of cast the deciding vote on an issue that they had. But no, they're gonna form a party. They're gonna form a governing coalition with the SPD. That's what's gonna happen. So the center left and the center right party.
So it's just going to basically be more of the same.
It's going to be the milquetoast, middle of the road party of the boomer pensioners that already got theirs and have no desire to protect Germany's unique history or culture. But all the people that voted for that party, that is exactly what they voted. That's what they wanted because they knew that would happen. That's what was promised. It's the party of the status quo.
Well, here's what I think. Here's what I think is going to happen: is the party of the status quo, which is that coalition between the center right and the center left. They can say all day long that Merz is far more Trump-like and far more conservative than Angela Merkel was. I don't care. That's like, again, it's like saying that Mitt Romney is more conservative than Lindsey Graham. okay, but like, where's the difference really? Like, where's the substantive difference? Here's what it really comes down to. Let's say Merz actually does want to, he's more conservative than Merkel. He gets in there. However, this guy's, I mean, he worked for BlackRock. And I'm sorry, at this point, I don't trust that. That's a huge red flag.
How could you
for
say
me.
somebody is Trump-like when they worked for BlackRock?
Yeah.
Trump had his own companies. He ran his own companies. He wasn't an employee of a really woke garbage company that's basically systematically tearing apart entire nations.
Yeah.
Look at this tweet here. Friedrich Merz, who's set to be the next chancellor,
new conservative chancellor,
says that it's clear that, quote, America does not care about Europe and has accused Elon Musk of election interference because Elon Musk endorsed AfD.
Yeah.
He held a virtual rally for them right before the election, and he basically encouraged, he even took out ads on his own site, on X, promoting AfD right before the election.
I want to get into what we think is going to happen next. So we already know that, again, CDU, center-right party that won the majority of the votes, is going to form a coalition, not with the second place party that's actually on the right, but with the third place party that's on the left, which means in order to do that, they're going to have to give them cabinet positions. So this is not as simple as saying, hey, we'll kind of vote for each other's stuff or we'll find compromise. No, they're going to give them positions in the government as a condition of them joining the coalition, which means they're going to get to influence. So here's my question. Do you think the CDU is going to do anything truly substantive on immigration when they have to form a governing coalition with the SPD and they have refused to work with AfD?
They already promised not to.
So they
already promised not to.
Yeah, they're not going to do anything substantive.
It's even worse than they've already promised not to.
Yeah.
They already have a track record of creating the problem.
Yep.
They were the party that opened the floodgates in 2015. It was Angela Merkel, CDU head, former chancellor of Germany, who came out there and said, we can do this. And by do this, she meant we can import and integrate millions of people from North Africa and the Middle East. Turns out you can't integrate them because it's almost on a monthly basis now that there's a mass terrorist attack in Germany. They had one right before the election. You know, do you remember the photo of the stabbing incident that took place? I think it was like in December.
Yeah.
Where, again, it was an Islamic terrorist attack and the police tackled the wrong man.
Yeah.
Who was actually a victim of the attack. And while the police were taking this man down, the guy with the knife ran up and stabbed one of the police officers who was subduing a completely innocent person. And that police officer died in that attack. And then it was, I believe it was in December in the Christmas market where the car drove into the crowd. Who knew that cars do that? Yeah, the car did it. Like, I'm sorry, but it goes, people are not interchangeable parts. And if they come from a particular part of the world that has a radically different worldview and culture and upbringing than in Western Europe, you cannot expect, it's lunacy to expect that if you import somebody from a completely alien part of the world and you just drop them into a country, that the magic soil of that country will just transform them into a German. That would never, I have a German last name.
Yeah.
That does not mean that I am culturally German. I'm an American through and through. I don't belong anywhere else. I don't speak the language. I don't share the same cultural traits and values. Now there's more overlap because we're a product of European civilization.
Sure.
So I understand there's more overlap than if you took somebody from North Korea and you dropped them in Germany, right? I get that. But the fact of the matter is that I belong in the United States. I don't belong in Europe because I'm not a European culturally. I'm an American. I should not expect, nobody should expect if you dropped me in the middle of Dresden that I would be able to just magically become a German overnight. I don't know. Maybe over a long enough period of time I can because there's overlap between our cultures. But the point that I'm trying to get across is you cannot just import people from halfway around the world, drop them in your country and expect them to just magically become Germans. It doesn't work like that.
And can we say something? They don't want them to.
No.
Like this is the left doesn't want people to become Germans, just like the left doesn't want people to become Americans. The left wants people to become leftists. Right? That's the allegiance. The allegiance point is leftism. It's not an American, it's leftism. Now, again, they can make a counterclaim. Well, okay, but your version of American is you want people to believe in certain fundamental principles. Yeah, I do, but those were usually associated with just being an American. And it used to be you could hold those principles regardless of your political party because there were certain underlying cultural, political, social, and economic things, religious things, which unified us as a people. And then we could have various differences of opinion with respect to how we adjudicated differences or how, what we prioritize with respect to our budgets or whatnot. But now we're talking about people that have a fundamentally different view of the world along all of those culturally shaping ideas. And the idea that it's like, well, that's just as good. Really? Okay, so if I dropped a German in Syria, the ruling regime there would be like, you know what? We can't judge.
You have a valid opinion.
We can't judge these Germans by, our laws because they were raised in different. No, that would not happen. That would not happen in any of these places. And guess what? The left wouldn't want it to happen because after all, they're oppressed and you're an oppressor. Right? This is like a self-loathing component of leftism. And so here's what I think is going to happen.
Managed decline is what I think is going to happen.
Here's what I think is going to happen. The CDU is going to form their coalition with the SPD. Nothing of actual substance on the issues which has caused a significant increase in popularity of the AFD is going to be addressed. The AFD, by essentially saying, fine, we'll sit here and stick to our guns and we'll wait you out because your party is dying and ours is not. And what ends up happening is that once again, now the new governing coalition, which will be the center-right party and the center-left party, will be the ones taking the blame for everything that happens while AFD says, we would do this, but we're not invited to the party. We would do this, but we're not invited to the party. And look, I'm familiar with this because in the General Assembly this year in Virginia, right, Democrats run the House and the Senate. We have the governorship. But in Democrats set a record this year for refusing to hear bills. Like that's unprecedented. We don't do that. We hear bills. We'll vote them down, but we hear them. And what ended up happening was the Democrat majority in the House delegates just said, well, it's an election year. Some of these bills are ones that we don't necessarily want to have to address in an election year, so we're just going to refuse to hear them. In a typical year, that might happen to anywhere between 5 to 10 bills. And usually you do it to your own party. In Virginia this year, it was 130 Republican bills never got heard. That's crazy. Now, why do I bring that up? Well, because once again, I think what you have is you have certain parties, certain factions within those parties that are used to a certain way of doing business. They're able to justify whatever their actions are. They believe that they'll constantly be in the ascendancy. They will use whatever political power they have to shut you down. If they can't beat you, well then, again, what did the Democrats do in Virginia this year? We're just not going to hear your bills that we think will hurt us in an election year. What are they doing over in Germany? They're going to form a coalition government. They're going to kick out the second most popular party. They're not going to let them be a part of any of the process. They're probably going to continue to work to find ways to either restrict or outright ban them, thinking that, well, if we just do that, then we'll stay in the ascendancy. And I think what's going to end up happening is the CDU is going to bleed people over to the AFD. The SPD is going to bleed people over to the left party. And you're going to start to see this push. What they keep saying that they're trying to stop is extremism.
They're creating it.
They're creating it. And this is what J.D. Vance was trying to tell him when he spoke to the Munich Security Conference. It's like, if you constantly tell an ever-growing sector of your population that essentially their opinions on things or their concerns for things don't matter because it doesn't fit within your narrative, well, the deal is that eventually they're not going to get rid of their opinions and concerns. They're going to get rid of you. Now, you can do that in one of two ways. You can either say, you know what, these are valid concerns, and so we need to start properly addressing them. But let's see if we can't find a process where we can do that. Or you're going to actually contribute to the extremism you think you're stopping. And look, I will say this. I don't think we've reached that kind of extremism within the United States. It's not a predominant part of like the Republican Party. But is there extreme elements on the right within the United States? Of course there are. There are some elements within the right that I'm not comfortable with. There's some elements that call themselves the right, like Nick Fuentes.
For a second, I thought Nick was talking about me.
No, that I don't think bear any resemblance to what we would consider to be the traditional right. But again,
but then again, monarchism has no tradition on the right in
we're
America.
Not getting into monarchism, Christian. It's not what we're doing. The point is why is all of this? Look, I'm going to go ahead and close it up right now. The reason why is all of this relevant? Why is what's going on in Germany relevant to the United States? Again, it's because you are seeing the same sort of demographic shift and the sort of response going on to mass immigration. You're seeing the response go to like wokeism. you're seeing this response go to this idea that the left has worked overtime to try to diminish the cultural traditions of a particular country. Because again, just like the left in the United States is not interested in people coming to the United States and becoming Americans, they want them to become leftists. It's the same thing over in Europe right now. And so you have German citizens who are not particularly, extreme in one sense or the other. They just want to be Germans, and they believe that German traditions and German culture is worth preserving and protecting, and on the whole being proud of. And what they're being told is, if you believe that, then you are far right, you are an extremist, you are a bigot, you want to take us back to a time in German history where it was, nationalist and dictatorial. And in order to stomp that out, what are they doing? Well, they're engaging in order to prevent what they fear is a return to German authoritarianism and nationalist totalitarianism. What are they doing? Well, they're banning free speech. They're trying to ban political parties. Right? They're engaging in this sort of authoritarian behavior that they claim to want to stop. And because they're so concerned with holding on to power, they're willing to demonize anybody that falls within a category that is just saying, look, it doesn't make sense to me that we're going to judge German citizens more harshly before the law than we would an immigrant that comes to Germany, rapes one of our people, and a judge has, they grew up in a different culture. Again, you told us that it was cultural relativism, that all cultures were equally valid and should be able to equally coexist within Germany. But then the moment a German breaks the law, they get the book thrown at them. And the moment somebody else that came into the country throws the law, they get special consideration because, their culture is different than ours. And it's not unreasonable for them to say, wait a second, if I travel to Yemen, I don't expect that they're going to give way to German culture in Yemen. We shouldn't have to expect to give way to Yemeni culture in Germany. This is not unreasonable. And what they're being told is, you're just a far-right extremist that wants to bring us back to the bad old days. And I remember watching this in Virginia when we said when all of a sudden this stuff was starting to come out, that this critical race theory, that some of this transgender stuff within our schools was starting to come out. And it was like, what are you pushing on our children? When they started to engage in very, very discriminatory practices, which were in many cases discriminating against Asian Americans. All of a sudden, you had people that had traditionally been kind of non-political. They voted for Democrats because they thought Democrats were the nice, empathetic, friendly people, friendly toward immigrants. But in reality, they were just hardworking people that, made their kids study 6 hours a night because they wanted to get them into a good college. And then all of a sudden, when they found out that their kids were not going to be allowed into a particular school because they were just too Asian, and they called up their representatives and they started to voice concerns with it, the response coming from the left was, you're just a bigoted racist. And they're like, I'm a first-generation immigrant. What are you talking about? And it's because it was never about the skin color. It was always about your commitment to leftist ideology, or to at least the party that was pushing leftist ideology. And the moment you came outside of that, all of a sudden you were demonized. And more people that at one point in their life might have been a little bit more left of center, or at the very least just thought, hey, I'm not really political. I just want to vote for the party that I think is the nice, tolerant people. All of a sudden they find themselves being categorized as bigots and sexists and misogynists and racists, simply because they want to live in a country which values the culture that created it. And if the major political parties, if the mainstream political parties, which have become more obsessed with maintaining some sort of status quo as opposed to addressing real issues, if they're not willing to reconsider some of the assumptions that were largely a creation of left-wing academia, they're going to lose. The difference is how bad do they want to lose, and who do they want to lose to? Because hopefully they lose to reasonable people that just want to live in a country that reflects the values which made that country possible in the first place. But that's not the only option. They could lose to something much worse. And so it remains to be seen what will happen. I think we're on the right direction here in the United States. I've never been more encouraged about the work that is being done in the United States. It is going to be interesting to see what happens in places like the UK, in France, in Germany. They have different political traditions. They have different histories. And so it can produce very, very different results. But one thing is absolutely clear. A growing sector of the population, a growing sector of the younger population is tired of the status quo, and they're not going to be ignored anymore. Once again, thank you very much for joining us. We hope you found this episode informative. I think I meant informative by that. We hope you found it informative. Once again, consider joining our community. You can find the link in the description there. If you want to have more input, if you want to join into the live episodes, if you want to have input on the things that we talk about, get your questions answered during the show, that's the place to do it, man. Check out our IC, our intentional community, in the link in the description. Once again, thank you very much for joining us, and we will see you next episode.